Hello and welcome to week 2 in Developmental Psych and chapter 2. How convenient. So week 2, chapter 2, we've made our way through chapter 1, learning a little bit about the science of developmental psych, how it's different from just regular psych, involves a lot of different disciplines to understand the human experience as it happens over time. And we're going to begin our journey really at the beginning. We're going to be looking at some prenatal development and seeing the important things that happen at that point that can affect us the rest of our lives. So here we are in chapter 2, heredity, prenatal development, and birth. Now before I launch into anything here, I want to highlight the Wizard of Oz. And I bring the Wizard of Oz up here because essentially Dorothy was put upon a quest. Her quest at first was to find the Emerald City. Then the great Wizard Oz sent him on a quest to bring back the witch's broom, if you've ever seen this movie. Now that those quests, I'm using this opportunity, using this analogy to remind you, many of you, of the part of this class that goes by the same name, which is quest, which is the part of this class where you're going to be going on and you're going to be playing the characters within a simulated environment and then taking quizzes about the developmental perspectives. Some people are galloping right along. They're getting some of these things done way ahead of time, and many of you have not, I don't think, logged in yet. So it's a really important 2 things you want to get started on really early in the class is, first, you want to get started on finding your biography subject and start that interview, and the second is start getting on those quests. I promise no flying monkeys. So please get into quest and start getting that particular part of the class done. So looking at the content, we look at genetics and prenatal development and stuff like this, looking at these beginning points of defining what our experience is as a human being. Let's talk about the genome. Now, you have probably taken a biology class or 2 in high school where you were introduced to the fact that inside every living human cell is a nucleus. In that nucleus, it contains the entire genetic code for that cell to be essentially whatever kind of cell it needs to be. All of our genes that define all of our biological being are contained in every single cell in our body, with the exception, of course, of sperms and eggs, which are what we might, I hope I can pull this out of the archives, they're haploid, meaning they only have half of the genetic code, and, when we go through that process of having sperm fertilize the egg, then they become diploid. I might be steering wrong. Don't rely on that. But we have this genetic code, and on this code we are really laying out, and to kind of put this in context, we're laying out the biological clock. The biological clock is the genetic timetable. It's made up, of course, 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 pairs are autosomes, and 1 pair is the sex chromosomes, which determine basically XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes, determining our sex. There is the process by which genes are expressed and activated. Now, it's important to recognize the genetic timetable in the context of understanding gene expression, because over time, different genes become expressed. So, let's say gray hair. Okay, well, that is in the genetic timetable. There's nothing you really can do about it genetically. And so as you're going through time, there's a clock, there's a biological clock that's ticking, and it turns on, and when that turns on, the cells that produce our hair stop producing the color-making mechanisms. They used to know what that was. Color-making part of our hair, we start to get gray hair. It's just one of those things that come on when puberty starts, when we can start having children, when we can stop having children. Physiological changes in our body, the continued connections in our brain, and maybe the diminished connections in our brain, these are all laid out within these instruction sets that we find in the genome. So these genes, what they start to do is there's a timeline by which genes will express themselves based on a specific age of that person. And then there are other genes that will be activated because of environmental factors. Because of the presence of a particular environmental factor, we will see that gene will start to express itself. There are, and maybe you remember this, there are genes that are dominant and there are genes that are recessive. And the dominant ones, particularly if you're looking at a trait that has expressions of dominance and recessive, so there's recessive expressions of that. This goes all the way back, if you remember, Mendelian genetics and wrinkled peas and round peas and all of that stuff, and looking at recessive genes, that you had to have a pair of recessive genes because if there was, for that recessive trait to realize itself, if there was at all the presence of the dominant gene, it would be the dominant trait that actually expresses itself. And it is in here, it is in this notion of expression over time, activation in the presence of particular stimuli, dominance and recessiveness, that we see the expression of genetic disorders. And I really leave it to the course book and the textbook to go over those individual disorders to see. Those are, of course, life-changing. An individual is born with that. It kind of sets the course for their life, at least in some aspects. It doesn't, obviously, having worked in disability almost my entire career, the notion of having a particular condition doesn't necessarily constitute a jail sentence. For the most part, individuals can adapt, and of course, environmental factors, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, start to play a role in where the person lives, and the technology and medical supports that are there will allow that person to have a very different life despite the fact that they have a genetic condition or a disorder. So we can see this is really kind of expressions of this biological clocks. And as we move on, continuing to have our discussion still about genes, we have the concept of genotype and phenotype. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier when we talk about dominant and recessive genes. The individual who, let's say, has a dominant gene for brown eyes, no matter what the matching gene is, let's say you have a brown-eyed mom and a blue-eyed dad, and they get together, if by chance the person ends up with the brown-eyed gene from their mom, that is going to be the one that expresses, even though that individual may have within them the genetic code for blue eyes. Now, that would almost necessitate that there's someone in the history of mom who currently has brown eyes, but if she was dominant on that gene, there would be no way for any of her children to have blue eyes. She would have to have a recessive gene present. It could be in any number of her eggs. And then, of course, we have dad who has two recessive, no matter what, he's going to contribute the blue-eyed kid. And so if it just so happens that there's an individual in mom's history and she's carrying the recessive gene of blue eyes, if it's a 2-gene determining factor like that, there is a 1 in 4 chance, 25% chance of a child from a brown-eyed mom and a blue-eyed dad to be born with blue eyes. A blue-eyed mom, that'd be recessive, and a blue-eyed dad can only produce blue-eyed kids. And I think I have the dominant and recessive things lined up there, blue eyes being the recessive gene. Genotype is the presence of the gene within us. So let's say we have it. It may not be expressed yet. Phenotype is when it becomes expressed. The gene is apparent. So we can be, let's say, carriers of a particular genetic condition, and we don't have it. But yet it's within our genome, and we have the capacity to pass it on to the next generation. The environment starts to play a role in this. And a person, just like I was saying before, a person born with a genetic endowment of some kind, born into a different kind of environment, well, of course, there'll be different ways in which that expresses itself. We seeing gene expression, once it comes out and it's in us, kind of depends on how the environment reacts. Let's say we were talking about, which we'll get into later in the class, but the feelings that trans individuals have of feeling more, let's say, male, despite the fact that they have a female genetic body, sex. When those genes begin to express themselves and the cognitive tendencies toward maleness, of course that's socially defined, but nonetheless, maleness that the individual is experiencing, the way in which the environment reacts to that will play a very important part in that person's successful ability to deal with that, the successful way to contend with that difference between their body and the person that they feel they are. So we see the environment very early on. Even though we're seeing things primarily determined by genetics, we see that environment plays an incredibly important role right off the get-go as to how accepting the environment is, such as in the example of gender identity, or how medically advanced the environment is in terms of some of the genetic disorders that we see. And so some other terms related to genes here, we have reciprocity, and this is that notion that genes and gene expression are interacting with the environment. And I use the example of professional athletes, an individual who has genetically predisposed to be a great basketball player, not me, born into a country that doesn't have basketball, well, we would never know that that person was great at basketball because there was no reciprocity. There was no reacting environment that allowed that individual to express those particular talents and skills. If the person is born into an environment that there's lots of basketball, then that individual could potentially determine the maximum expression of those particular genes and become a pro basketball player. All of this is housed within the field of behavioral genetics, where we look at that complex relationship between our genetic genotype, phenotype, the expressions, and the way in which that fits within the psychosocial environment that we see. And you really want to get down to it, this is the nature and nurture control. I'm going to avoid versus. For years we talked about nature versus nurture. What is it? Is it genetic? Is it environmental? It's always both. So let's just say nature and nurture. But what we're really talking about in behavioral genetics is that component about our humanness, where what is that reciprocal relationship between the genome, genotype, phenotype in particular, and the environment that will allow the expression of particular traits as they begin to develop over time. Of course, we're going to have that going on throughout the class. Now, this, in a way, refers a little bit to the historical clock. And I'll use those two examples. Someone had a genetic condition years and, centuries ago. They may have died because the medical technology wasn't available, and that yet today that person with the same medical condition, genetic, would not necessarily pass away because of the advances in technology. Now consider much more within our lifespan individuals who were born eventually to have a phenotype of trans, the individual born years and years ago may not have experienced any sort of support, and their actual experience of that may have been very different. Being born into a world right now, or finding yourself, with those kinds of phenotype expressions going on, in a world that remains and is becoming increasingly open to that notion, provides for a very different reciprocal relationship between those gene expressions and the environment. So the nature-nurture thing, dynamic, is extremely different, and we could see that changes over time in relation to what we would call the historical clock. Little icon I put up there. The historical clock is at play. When you were born certainly will play a large role in terms of how the environment creates this reciprocal relationship with your expressed phenotype. Now, in terms of brain development, I have this graphic in the course book, and you can see, and there's a couple videos and whatnot, and you can see the brain developing, and we're going to see when we talk about teratogens here that the neurological system is the first, and it is always under development in utero, meaning while the pregnancy is going on. The nervous system is frontmost in terms of its development. So let's look at some factoids related to this. Here we have neurogenesis is the actual processes by which the nervous system develops, and it develops in a number of ways. And one is the proliferation of nerves. This is meaning the rapid development of new neurons, new neurological tissues. And it's kind of staggering to think that from conception until birth, that's just that kind of like 9 months there, we have to produce 100 billion nerve cells. This is a rate of proliferation of 250,000 new nerve cells every minute for 9 months. This is staggering. Think about that cell division from Bio 101, with the mitosis and all that stuff. 250,000 times a minute. Of course, there's different ups and downs. Sometimes it's even faster than that. As neurological development is happening, proliferation is happening. It's amazing how many nerve cells are being developed to create the 100 billion nerve cells that we have in our bodies when we're born. And as our starting set of nerve cells, we have to produce 250,000 per minute for those 9 months. Another way in which we see neurons developing over time is differentiation. Now, we often draw a neuron, and I didn't include it in here, but you have the cell, and you have the axon going along, and the dendrites kind of on each side, and you just have this sort of picture of a neuron. They don't all look like that. Pain neurons look different than temperature neurons. They look different than movement neurons. They look different than the neurons that we have for thinking. They look different than the neurons that we have in the retina of our eye. I mean, the neurons become, they start off just as, stem cells. They're just basic cell. And then based on a chemical environment within the developing body, they begin to proliferate. They begin to change, and they start to become the type of neurons that they're destined to be. Just like you and I. We may have career ambitions. You can almost look at this cell as a career ambition. And our career ambitions, although they may reside largely as a function of our recognized talents and propensities towards certain kinds of activities, these are definitively shaped by the environment. Just like the would-be career of a nerve cell as it's growing up and it's becoming differentiated from its peers and it's going off into its own career is impacted by the biochemical environment in which it resides. So the nerves start to change. They start to change their physical structure. They start to change their chemical structure so that they can fulfill the purpose that they're destined to based on the genetic code. Now, one of those things that happens during the process of differentiation is this notion of neuron migration, is that neurons will travel through the spatial cavity that is eventually to become the new human body to the place at which they will reside. I'll use the analogy again. We grow up, we graduate from high school, the little cell graduates from high school, it's a little stem cell waiting to go, and it moves away. It moves away in order to go find its fortune someplace else. So just like we do that in our lives, sometimes the neuron travels along these microfibers that exist within the spatial area of where the developing child is happening in the brain and in the body, and the nerves actually crawl along these particular fibers. And to demonstrate that, I have sort of a little bit of a movie that I've included in here. And you'll see if I play this movie, you see it right over here, that's a nerve cell right there that is making its way along these nanofibers. And you can see another image here, it's going to come up. We have, see, they've color-coded them, but you can see the neurons traveling. And the video is going to stop here. So the neurons traveling that distance away from where they were birthed to where they're going to be an eye cell, or they're going to be a hearing neuron, or they're going to be a temperature neuron on the end of your finger. And they follow a genetically determined pathway. This is of great mystery to developmental psychologists as they try to comprehend the complexity of these instructions that are carried out throughout the development of our nervous system. Now, another way in which we see the neuron development, of course, is in synaptogenesis, and this is the increased branching out and interconnections between cells through the development of synapses. And synapses, if you remember from your intro class or the biology class, you took up neurology a little bit, it's where neurons actually don't touch each other, but the synapses are the place in which one neuron communicates with another, and they communicate through a process of transfer of neurotransmitters, which are specialized chemicals for communication within the nervous system. Getting a little mind-boggling, isn't it? I hope you feel that, because whenever I talk about that, when I teach biopsychology, it just is boggling to the mind, the complexity, the nuances, the way in which the biology and the chemistry and the electricity of the nervous system actually produces what we have as awareness, and perception and hearing great music and appreciating it. It's just an absolutely mind-boggling process. Now, so we see neurogenesis, the generic component here of the developing nervous system taking place, neuron proliferation up to 250,000 per minute, differentiation, neurons becoming their career, neuron migration, moving away from home, and then finally synaptogenesis, making connections. And boy, move to a new town, start making connections. It's kind of like life, isn't it? Here's the life of the neuron, sort of as a microcosm of our own lives. We're born, we develop kind of like the basics, move away into a new town to become who we are. We start differentiating ourselves from our family of origin. We start making new connections. And pretty soon, we don't look at all like we used to look like. We're very different, very specialized, and comfortable in our new role. So, great little analogy for neurological development. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the application of the developmental perspective. And I'm going to use critical periods to describe this. Like in chapter 1, I introduced you to my concept of the developmental perspective, DV as I like to tell it. The developmental perspective was basically, when did it happen? You know, and let me give you some context to why I make that such an important thing. When I was working as a social worker, I was often involved in individuals who had the onset of mental illness, the onset of accidents and disabling conditions. Let's say a car accident where a person's spine was broken and they had a new disability. And one of the most important questions that we had to address in terms of that person acclimating to a new life living with the disability, you know, we can go through rehabilitation as much as you can to bring that person back to their highest level of functioning, but often there's some residual change from that person, who that person was prior to the onset of their disability and then after they have that disability. And we have to adapt or help the individual adapt and live life to their fullest, learn how to do things in a different way sometimes in order to accommodate for the presence of that disability. Now, when the stuff that we would focus on, of course, are the very important aspects of their life going on. And we can ask ourselves, let's say somebody has a spinal cord injury and they become in need of using a wheelchair to get around. One of the first questions that we might ask is, how old is this person? So what aspects of their life are going to be impacted by this particular disability? So if the individual, let's say they're in grade school, then we look at the environments in which people are in grade schools, because now the disability hit when they were like in 5th grade. What are 5th graders doing? How is the environment at the school? And not only physical barriers, but psychosocial barriers. You know, they're going to be able to reestablish connection with friends. We know that that's really important. We know that they're beginning to develop pre-adolescent sort of notions in terms of the importance of relationships that will then, of course, bear fruit in their adolescent years. They're starting to develop lots of aspects of their sense of industry, which we'll get into later in this class. Industry coming from Erickson's psychosocial theory. In this age, they're becoming good at things, and suddenly you have an individual that's become, I don't know, for lack of better terms, really bad at walking, really bad at going around. I don't mean that in any sort of negative way, but let's say that individual was particularly athletic, or they ran around a lot, they liked playing games and whatnot. Think about how profound that would be for that individual's development. So we would certainly want to take a look at those sort of normative things that are going on. So in this chapter, we can take a look at the developmental perspective, really precise, and we can think about all the very rapidly developing mechanisms that are happening during the 9 months in which a child is developing inside of their mom. We can ask ourselves, well, what if something comes along and interrupts that process the same way an accident would come along and interrupt the processes that are happening to our 5th grader? And we'd say, well, what kind of things? And we had presence of nicotine and smoke, presence of drugs, alcohol, accidents, stress, poor nutrition, all of these things that can happen to mom that inadvertently can affect the development of the child. The collective term for anything that can come along and interrupt the normative developmental processes of an in utero child is called a teratogen. And years ago, when I had a nurse practitioner midwife come into my class and do a presentation on teratogens, her perspective was everything's potentially a teratogen except folic acid. She had a whole big thing on folic acid, something to talk to your doctor about. But almost anything, if you have too much of it, too little of it, or something like that, is potentially going to affect the unborn child. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You're rolling dice. But I have a chart for you. Had a little glimpse of it. It's in your course book. And we're going to take a look at that chart. First, let me explain how this chart works. What we have are critical periods, and these are periods of time during which particular aspects of development are happening. We're going to see this later as well in terms of critical periods, and when do we stop having critical periods, we'll see. We'll have that discussion. But across the top we have time, and over time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 to 36 weeks, 38 weeks. We're looking at the entire gestational period here. What's going on? What's developing during these periods of time? And if you look way down at the bottom, you'll see kind of the key to understanding here. We have a bar going across. The first word is loss. Let's see that right. Get my mouse going here. Oh, my mouse won't go. You have loss down here at the bottom left. And then if it's pink, this is when there's major development happening. During these, when all the pink areas is when that particular aspect of the body is under critical development. And then in the orange are areas where the development is continuing, but a lot of it's done and it's just kind of like finishing touches going on. So if we draw a line that indicates when a teratogen made itself known, and we put our line right there, right at the, Thursday on week 1, okay, that's when the teratogen happened. Now, if there was going to be an impact of that teratogen on the unborn child, we see that down at the bottom, it's in the block called loss. Now this means a teratogen coming this early, if it is affected, will most likely terminate the pregnancy. It is just too vulnerable at that point to survive any degree of teratogen. In fact, many people consider that many pregnancies are lost this way, and you never even knew you were pregnant. If you think about, just in these weeks, an individual may miscarry very, very early in the pregnancy, but all they consider it just a natural menstrual cycle, and they never knew they were pregnant. The natural process. Exposed to teratogens, or whatever, genetically something goes wrong, or biochemically something is not the right time for that baby to be developing, and a termination of that pregnancy happens spontaneously. Now, there's a period of time before which individuals become aware that they're pregnant, and often, as we can see in these early weeks here, these early 3rd, 4th, 5th week, an individual may still not know that they are pregnant, and if they do, let's say recreational drink, they may or may not have an impact on the child's life as they continue to live their lives, not knowing that they're pregnant. So let's look at another line. Let's say we drew the line here. And what we're going to see, this is the Thursday on the 5th week. So let's say there's a teratogen that happens there. The person takes the wrong medication or something like that. Let's just keep it innocuous or not really intending on causing harm. And you'll see that the line passes through the development of the nervous system and the heart, the upper and lower limbs, the ear, and the eye, that these things, they're in the pink. So these things are under critical development on Thursday of week 5. And a teratogen coming in could have a profound impact on those particular areas of development. You can see palate and teeth haven't even started yet. They haven't started developing, so there's not going to be an effect on those, but certainly you'll see that partway through week 5, a teratogen could have profound effects. Let's move the line a little bit here. Here we have right on week 8, and we can see again, still the nervous system, the ear, the palate, teeth, and external genitalia are all being potentially significantly impacted, but the eye, the heart, upper and lower limbs, they're in the orange now. So probably a lot of the development that happens is already going to happen. And if you look down at that chart again at the bottom, you'll see functional and maybe minor abnormalities in that area might happen. Anything that's getting impacted in the pink might get some major abnormalities. It might lose its function. And then if it's in the orange, we see just functional and minor abnormalities. Let's do one more. Let's move the line way over here to, maybe the end of week 37, and we'll see the neurological system, possibly functional and minor abnormalities, the eye, still under development, and then teeth and external genitalia still being potentially functional and minor abnormalities. Now, mind you, there's still enough teratogen can harm a child and cause a spontaneous abortion. And so there's no guarantees. There's no guarantee that there will be an effect, and there's no guarantee that there will not be an effect. And so it's a time to be careful and mindful and follow the dictates of your doctor and whatnot, and that's the best path. Now, switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk now in that development that's happening. We had all kinds of the parts of the body, and we'll see, and we include the discussion of that in developmental psych, because let's say I was born with a condition that affected my legs. Even though that's not directly my brain or my psychology or whether, the fact that I have differently functioning legs my whole life will affect my outlook on life, will affect what I get involved in, will affect what I do. And so all of these aspects of development are very significant. A good friend of mine who I play racquetball with was born and later developed, well, of course he was born, sorry about that, developed, this is not good. I'm making this up, so bear with me here. He developed the condition, I'll get to it, in his left arm, polio. And his left arm is functionally very, very limited. It has very little muscle mass, has very little control, and it's significantly smaller than the other arm that he has, and having that impacted his life. Having that come along impacted his life to the point that just yesterday we were chatting, went and visited him, and we were chatting with him, and he talked about his history in sports, that he ended up being a professional tennis player for real, and he chose tennis because it was one of the sports that not only did he naturally excel at it, but you didn't need two hands. You didn't need two fully functioning hands. And we had a really interesting conversation about how he had to adapt the way he moved around the court, the way he would serve the ball, the way he held his racket so that he can change his grip, because many people use their non-dominant hand to actually hold the racket while their right hand changes the grip. And just a very interesting conversation about how do you adapt, because you have this less functioning part of your body playing a sport that that requires only that one arm. And so what if he had never got polio? Would he have become a professional tennis player? I don't know. Maybe he would have tried. Maybe he would have really loved basketball, never excelled at basketball, just loved playing it. Interesting how fate works. Now, as we transition into this, we look at all the body kind of developing all of these things that we look when we talk about teratogens and critical periods. there is a pattern. This is not haphazard. And the pattern is defined by the directions of development that we have. So here we have a young infant. This is just an icon here. And I want to delineate for you some areas of the body that we talk about when we're looking at directions of development, and that is the midline. This is the line going vertically through our body, the midline, starting at the crown of our head, going right to our tail. And then, of course, the head and tail. Now, the midline defines left and right. The head and the tail defines top and bottom. And when we talk about development, and we'll see this in the development of gross and fine motor development, when we talk about that in the next couple chapters here, that we see patterns of development, and these patterns are reflected in the processes of neurogenesis, such as neuron migration, differentiation, and as we'll talk about later, myelination. And we see that these processes happen in a spatial order. So the first spatial order that I want to talk about is cephalocaudal. Cephalo referring to the head, caudal referring to the tail. Neurological neurogenesis happens from the top down. So if we're going to look at a direction of development, we have development happening in the head, and then it progresses down the body toward the tail. So the head is way more developed than, let's say, the shoulders, which are way more developed than the torso, which are way more developed than the hips, at any given point in time in terms of development. Now, so that's head to tail, cephalocaudal development. The next type of development we see is proximal distal. And this is that midline. The midline is internal and close, as in proximity. And then distal means far away. So along with cephalocaudal, head to tail development, we also get internal to external. So we see a progression of development moving from the midline out from the body. We will definitively see this when we start to see how very young children move from basically being able to roll over all the way up until they're running around the house, and we'll see definitively head to tail, proximal to distal development. The child will first raise their head. You can see that the muscles in the back of the neck are way more developed than their arms. And then we see, in terms of development later on, we see that they can move their arms around way before they can move their hands around, and way before they can move their fingers. So we see that proximal distal development happening in that way as well, when we're looking not only at gross motor development, but how gross motor development leads to fine motor development. Now that brings us throughout pregnancy and into birthing. Now, in the course book, I go over some material related to different expectations for birthing, what different people like to do, different cultural views on birthing and whatnot. In fact, normally when I teach this class, this is when I introduce what I think is one of the most interesting assignments in this class, which is the cultural aspects of birthing assignment, where I would normally ask you to make believe that you're the training person for volunteers at a birthing center, and to develop a training for 2 new cultural groups that are coming into your area, and research their practices for birthing, what they expect, what happens to the placenta, What are the spiritual, religious sort of ramifications? Who's in the room? Who's involved? All of those things so that we can be culturally sensitive to that particular individual, or as a center, sensitive to all of those individuals who may be coming into our area and seeking our services. Because I added the quest aspects to this class as a sort of research project for me to determine the value of that, I'm not asking you to do this assignment, but take the time to kind of, maybe even just on your own, to look up different cultural practices related to birthing. And even within our own culture, the notion of individuals either going to a birthing center at the hospital, or having home births, or maybe even water births that are starting to happen more and more in this area. And considering, what are your thoughts about an individual who chooses to have a midwife, or chooses to have their grandmother there and have their child at home, or the individual who chooses to have their child in a hospital? And just the different value systems and what's important. Debate. We're not here to determine what is the right answer to that, but we can certainly get to know each other better as we explore what we think is the best way to approach that particular situation. So that brings us to the end of this chapter 2. And so let's take a look at the assessments that are for this week. We have the first discussion is looking at behavior and genetics. And here I want you to reflect on your own particular traits. And I want you to express, good word, I'm talking about genetics, I want you to express, where'd you get it? Did you get it from mom? Did you get it from dad? Is it a grandparent that you're very much like? And tell the story about your particular traits. Pick one that is, and discuss the nature and nurture component. Maybe you're very much like your father, let's say, but not only because you might have got the genetic predisposition for whatever, but there was also the environmental support for that particular trait to come through. Let's say your parents were very athletic. You can imagine that athletic parents who were very involved in sports will almost naturally, almost guaranteed, will create an environment for their children, regardless of their children's natural ability, for sports to happen. So any individual born into that family would, of course, be encouraged to get involved in sports. Hopefully it'd be okay if they didn't, but the individual would go into sports and they would live in a very supportive environment that would be okay with buying the equipment and okay with driving you to practice and all that stuff, because it'd be culturally normal within that group to do so. So having a discussion about your traits and where they came from and how they were supported or not supported in your particular environment. The next discussion is that one about birthing. Just if you've had children, what kind of processes did you go through? Read up on different practices in our culture, in the U.S. culture, and if you have experience or knowledge about other cultures, to bring those to the table as well, having a discussion about those. And then there's a quiz where I ask you about teratogens, and then I ask you a couple questions to describe and give examples of the directions of development: cephalocaudal, proximal distal development. Now, you're going to see these a lot. You're going to see describe, you're going to see define and give me an example. Define, you can copy that out of the book. Give me a definition. Example is an example. It's not a definition. So let's say we're talking about proximal distal development and say, well, when I was, proximal distal, it's from the midline working outward, neurological development happens in that direction, and you give me an example. Yeah, the shoulders before the elbow. That's not an example. What I want is, my cousin Timmy, when I noticed my cousin Timmy was, when he could do a push-up, but his legs were not functioning at more of a cephalocaudal, but he could do a push-up, and he ended up walking with his legs dragging behind him, which is a clear example of cephalocaudal development. His shoulder and upper arm strength was doing fine, even though his tail end was really not up to speed yet. That's what I mean by example. Give me a real world example. So make sure that you add that extra effort going into the actual quiz questions. And that brings us to an end. That's it for this week. So have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you in the discussion.